Joining me now is Ivo Daalder, former U.S. ambassador to NATO during the Obama administration. He's also the president of the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. Ambassador, you just heard from Olena about the difficulty in even just containing basic issues like not blowing up a nuclear plant or evacuating those people who are in those areas that have now fallen under Russian control. But one of the things Olena was saying is that they continue to need help from the West. You were a former United States ambassador to NATO. NATO is clearly on high alert. We're in a NATO country right now that I'm broadcasting from. What is it that NATO can do to prevent what we are watching unfold in Ukraine?
Well, in theory, what it can do is intervene directly into the conflict. It has military capabilities, and it could, in a whole variety of ways that people have been talking about, including what Olena said, get involved, including with a no-fly zone. But you'd have to understand that that is a decision by NATO to go to war against Russia. There's no military involvement in this conflict if short of declaring in de facto, if not actually de jure, really in a fundamental way, war against Russia. Take a no-fly zone. In order to make sure that Russian aircraft and helicopters are not able to fly over the Ukrainian airspace, you would need massive numbers of NATO aircraft in order to shoot them down or at least prevent them from coming into the Ukrainian airspace. And in order to defend these aircraft, you would have to take out the Russian air defense system, not just in Ukraine, but also in all the parts of Russia that could reach over the skies of Ukraine. So in effect, that is declaring war. NATO has decided, as they have reaffirmed yesterday after a extraordinary foreign minister meeting in Brussels, that NATO is not going to get directly involved, that the purpose of NATO here is to defend its members. Ukraine is not a member, and for the rest to find ways to damage and hurt the Russians and Vladimir Putin and the cronies around him as much as possible through economic sanctions and those kinds of means. It's devastating to see what we're seeing on your screens. It is horrific what the Russians are doing, but we have to be clear. This is not because NATO isn't doing enough. It is because the Russians have decided to attack unprovoked a neighboring country, and frankly to engage in the kind of warfare that is so brutal, so devastating, that people will be held to account down the road. It doesn't help the people for Ukraine now. People. Yes, please.
I want to ask you, Ambassador, Vladimir Putin has said that any of these things that you described, aggressive actions, as he calls them, by NATO would be thought of as a declaration of war. He's even said that cyber attacks would be considered a declaration of war. At what point is NATO able to, what's the line? What's the point at which NATO can get up to without something that involves war with Vladimir Putin, who has made reference to his nuclear arsenal a couple times in the last week? How far can they go? Because the Ukrainian president continues to ask for more from NATO.
Well, how far they can go is up to the very border line that separates a NATO country from a non-NATO country. And you're right at that border. Literally, it does not include Ukraine. NATO countries individually have decided that they will provide Ukraine with the means to defend themselves. Weapons, anti-aircraft weapons, anti-tank weapons, body armor, you name it, you can provide that, because that is not the line that would be crossed. Although Vladimir Putin may think it's a line, it's not. It is helping Ukraine to defend itself. We can provide intelligence information, and I'm sure we are providing intelligence information to help the Ukrainians fight as heroically as they are right now against the Russians. But actual involvement of military forces or direct NATO forced attack on Russian capabilities would be crossing that red line.
Ivo Daalder, thank you for your time this morning. Ivo Daalder is a former United States ambassador to NATO under President Obama and the president of the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. Unfortunately, I feel like we're going to need to turn to you several times over the course of the next few days. We appreciate your time this morning.